Hi everyone, welcome to this special Touchpoint event for Service Design Day. We're just still letting some people in and we'll get started shortly. Okay, some people are still coming in. I'll give it half a minute more. I hope everyone's been following social media on today on Service Design Day. Okay, let's kick it off. I'd like to begin by just welcoming everyone here. I'm Jesse Grimes. I'm the editor-in-chief of Touchpoint. I'm very happy that we can have this event today in recognition of an issue that we published recently, and of course that it's Service Design Day. We're going to be together for an hour. I would like to say that this is being recorded, so if you would not like to be on camera, if you do happen to realize your image shows up, please turn your camera off, but this is also so people can watch it who happen to miss it today. We've got an hour. I'm just going to do some introductions. I will hand over to Josina Vink for the first talk, in which she's going to put a bit of context around the issue of the topical issues we had about service design and systems thinking. Then we're going to hear from three other authors, and there'll be a short discussion between the authors, and then we'll be opening it up for Q&A. So the actual questions that you're able to put in the chat, I'll be picking some out, and then in the last 15, 18 minutes or so, I'll pick those out and I'll pose them to the panel. Do please keep your microphones on mute, just for the background noise. And I'd like to now introduce the three speakers. Josina, who you will hear from first, actually wrote, again, this introduction to the theme of the section. She's an associate professor of service design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and has more than 10 years of industry experience. And her current research focuses on systemic approaches to service design in healthcare. Tuomas Harviainen is an associate professor of information practices at Tampere University in Finland, a design management researcher at Aalto University, and also a freelance service designer. Paul Neeley is joining us as well. He's a designer and researcher based in London, consulting in service and speculative design at Neeley worldwide, optimizing happiness with Masamichi Sosu, exploring future practices at the School of Critical Design, and also a tutor in the service design program with the Royal College of Art. Kristel van Aal is a managing partner at Neman in Belgium. It's a human-centered design agency in Brussels. She's also the lead author of the Service Design and Systemic Design Toolkits. Kristel is a co-teacher in product, service, and system design, and a lead teacher in systemic design at the Antwerp University in Belgium. And Suneet Kumar is a founder of Dignify Lab, a systems and service design firm. His work is focused on comprehending and designing complex systems with a keen focus on human dignity, which he's been applying to the domains of global banking and social development. So those are our four speakers. They're each going to, following Josina's introduction, have a short talk on their contributions to this issue's article. And I'd like to begin by handing it over to Josina for her introduction.
Perfect. Thank you, Jesse.
Josina, take it away.
All right, let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I think one of the things that we're seeing in this special issue is this kind of systems turn or movement that is happening within the service design domain. So I'm just going to very briefly set a context for some of this discussion and go through some of what has been inside this special focus on systems thinking. So we can see that service design is kind of over the course of the last several decades, increasingly expanding its scope of the practice, moving from just kind of a focus on narrow touch points into more service systems and society at large. But along with this, we have some critical global crises, from climate change or global warming to issues with our healthcare system exposed by COVID-19 and eroding democracies and things like this. And service design is being called to respond to some of these critical crises. And in these processes, we've come to a greater level of awareness, I think, about the limitations and risks of more narrow reductionist approaches that have been in place around service design. So I think we can see within this dialogue need and recognition of the need to better grapple with complexity, and that we actually need to incorporate systems thinking in order to really realize the transformative nature of service design practice. And I think the exciting thing for service design is that the integration of systems thinking actually challenges the very core of service design and some of the fundamentals of the thinking. So just to set a scene a little bit for what's in this special issue and some of the things we'll be digging in today, there have been kind of 4 critical evolvements that I saw when reading this special issue and the different contributions from all around the world. The first one is around rethinking the principles of the practice. So some folks were challenging some of the existing projects and the externalities, which Jay Paul will get into. Others were really challenging the kind of human-centered design paradigm that we've been working within, or kind of old models of like Tim Brown's feasibility, desirability, and viability, and really rethinking these things. We've also seen there were a number of contributions, which Kristel will talk a little bit about her perspective, the need to really adapt and apply alternative approaches and methods and tools when doing service design work, if integrating systems thinking. So we've seen some new tools and methods be developed, like ecosystem mapping, and Kristel has this huge toolbox and canvases that have been developed. But others more thinking we need to adjust some of the existing service design tools, like service blueprints and others. So I think there's a bit of a debate happening around what happens to our methods now that I hope we'll dig into. The third theme is around integrating knowledge from other domains. So bringing in knowledge around systems intelligence, around systems thinking, around implementation science or improvement science and other things to actually strengthen service design. And that if it's really going to grapple with this level of complexity, maybe we need to really get better at integrating those things. And we have some great case studies that feature kind of like how people are working to do this. And then the last theme, which I think is particularly important as well, is around not just seeing the integration of systems thinking and service design, seeing that we have then a neutral perspective of the overall system, but actually recognizing kind of some of the power asymmetries and addressing some of the systemic inequalities head on. And we see some interesting examples of this in the special issue, as well as folks who are working inside the service design domain to actually grapple with power and diversity within that space, which I think is extremely important. And we've been seeing more and more exposure around the design industry at large and how there's work to be done on that. So we'll just end with the note of kind of my key takeaway from the various contributions that folks have made, which is that in order for service design to support these necessary transitions in service systems and society, it must first transform itself. And I think you'll hear some examples and provocations from the next speakers coming up around how this could might be able to be done and kind of move us along in this journey. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jesse, for shifting.
Yes, thanks, Josina. And Kristel, I can see if you're ready to join and share what your contribution to this piece was about, that would be great.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My contribution was about two things. One is the toolkit in general, and the second thing is a case that we did for the government. So first of all, about the toolkit in general, I started flirting with systemic design like 10 years ago. It all started at the university because I was asked to teach product service systems design, where are integrated. In that time, I had already made a toolkit for service design, and I integrated the methodology of the school, which I knew because I studied there, with the service design methodology to make a whole for the students. But then I couldn't find anything about the system, and I was really quite kind of frustrated. So where is the system in all this thing? And then I started to read, to discover that there is a whole world out there, very academic, that is all about systems thinking. So I spent like 2 years really reading papers, and like understand what the fuck is this all about. I found a lot of different concepts, very scattered in all different directions, but I couldn't find like, what is the grammar here? How do you use this thing? And so that's how I started then to design tools and to try to find how does this all fit together? How can we make a methodology out of this? And then by 2014, I had the first version of it, and 2014-15. And I also discovered that there is an international community, which is called the Systemic Design Association, that has an annual conference and internationally. And I decided in 2015 to go there. That was in Toronto, to present the toolkit and to just check what does the community says about this. And we did a workshop there, which was really stressy because it's all like very people who know very well what systems thinking and systemic design is, but actually they loved it. And then that's also where I met Peter Jones for the first time, and Alex Ryan, which is also one of the founders of the foundation. And then like a year later, in the next conference in Oslo, when the toolkit was even elaborated further, Peter and I decided to join forces to develop the toolkit further. And that's basically what we have been doing since then. Tried to develop new tools. We are now about like 40 plus tools, trying to see which are the best ones. The ones that are, we also publish them, some online in Creative Commons. The ones that are online now are basically the core tools. And the ones we are developing now are like extra tools to evaluate, to do better user research, etc. But the core tools are really online. And so basically, if you can see it in the touch points, we made a methodology beautifully linear, which is not absolutely not in that way in reality, but it consists basically of 7 steps. You start by trying to understand what is the system about, where does the system stops. Well, it never stops, but for a project, you have to define like, what are the boundaries here of the system? Then you go out and we call it listening to the system. You really try to find out what are all those contributing factors that are making that the system is not functioning very well today. And also what are the dynamics over time? Could be from the history to the future. And then with all this material, you go back and in your studio or in a workshop with clients, you're trying to bring everything together in what we call system maps. We often use causal loop system maps. That's a way of designing all the interdependencies, throwing all the interdependencies in the system by drawing all the connections and trying to see if you can discover dynamics that keep the system stabilized or withhold it for change or is leading to reinforcing things. And then with all those elements, we try to see like, where are the leverage points? Where are the points in the system that has the most potential to intervene? And then we combine a bunch of those leverage points. The next step, we first make very explicit, why do we want to do this? What is this future that we want to achieve? what is the value that we want to produce on different levels. So micro level, meso level, macro level, and on different perspectives, not only economical, but also ecological, psychological, social. You can even add more perspectives. And once this is done, so we know where to intervene, we know where we want to head, then we really go into the more designer mode. So we're going to say, what is now the strategy we can use, the intervention strategy, which cocktail do we need, and on which level in the system should or can we intervene? For example, should we change the complete paradigm of the system, and should we change rules? Should we change goals? Should we change the way information is spread to the system? So we look at different levels, and then in the next step, which is called designing the intervention model, we turn them into activities and boundary conditions. And then finally, the last step is all about the transition. Now you have this idea, you have this intervention model. How will you then bring it in the existing system, which system folks call the regime, and make sure it has enough space to grow and to develop into the actual practices. So that is what the methodology is about. And for all of those steps, I developed several tools, which the goal of those tools is that to be able to work in co-creation workshops with people, with stakeholders from the system that don't know anything about not systems thinking, not service design, not even design thinking. And by the canvases, they should grasp a new way of thinking and be able to go along. And actually it works. So that's a nice thing. And then I see the time ticking. In the Touchpoint, we give an example of a project. This is basically the project that's described there is the first real project for a real client. Because before that, we did trials, we did little things within our own project, but this was a client DAV. It's the administration simplification in Flanders, and I was already working with them since 5 years, with, among other things like Theory U, for the ones who know it. And so it was a client who was very open for new methodologies, new experimentations. And she said, let's use it. Let's just use it on a case. And so we used this on the case of pregnant women which are in poverty and who are actually in Belgium. They have a free program from the federal government where they can roll in to get checks up, etc., in their pregnancy, but they are not using it. And so the big question was, why are they not coming to us? Why don't they refuse this healthcare? And so we discovered a lot of things. One that we discovered was, for example, the fear of the system. The fact that they, especially generation poverty, they saw their children being taken away. Another thing was, for example, the coldness of the system. The fact that especially the doctors, they really look upon these women, and it's like everything. These women feel not appreciated. It's like everything we do is bad. We are not. I mean, they are not respected by the system. But we also found some interesting things, like, for example, that pregnancy is really a momentum for these women. The moment they are pregnant, they are like ready to change a lot of in their lives. And they don't need that much to do it. They just need opportunities. They just need basically a person to trust, which can help them to improve their actual situation. And what is even nicer is that this recommendation that we made, because we went to the intervention, the activity model, and the recommendation that we made is now a federal recommendation from the health government. This was 8 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Kristel. Just a reminder from everyone, if you have any questions based on these talks, you can put them into the chat and we'll see to get to them at the end of today. Now I'd like to invite Suneet Kumar to share his presentation. Welcome, Suneet.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'll just quickly share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm pretty new to this, so either I'm going to screw up massively in front of 190 odd people, or this is going to go really well. But anyways, I'd like to extend my heartiest gratitude to the SDN team as well as the Touchpoint team. And it's an amazing opportunity for me, and I really, really appreciate your efforts for this. Thank you so much. Okay, let's quickly get started with the talk, and I have my timer on 8 minutes. It's fine. Okay. So the topic that my article was on is essentially non-linear approaches to service design. So I'm going to make this a very quick visual kind of representation. Okay, so what do I mean when I say that? What do I mean about linear approaches first? In order to understand non-linearity, first, let's just have a look at what it means to be a household appliance, something like a toaster, where we know that, okay, this is a piece of machinery where the parts and the relationship between all of these various nuts, bolts, the battery, the wire, etc., they're largely known, right? So if we do know that, okay, the toaster is not functioning properly, in that case, we can just see that, okay, this is the part that's not working properly, and then you sort of tweak it. It can be a loose wire, and then it's sort of, it works again for the most part. Let's assume it works. So what happens is that this linear approach, unfortunately, has percolated into the field of service design, and it has sort of taken over our perspectives as well. We sort of have, though we call, like organizations to be living, breathing organisms, that's just, in my honest opinion, it's like lip service, because we honestly do treat them as large factories, large pieces of machinery. And what we do in this case is, I'm just going to give you a small example about one of the projects that we did to show you how exactly a linear approach kind of works. And then I'm going to contrast it with what a non-linear approach sort of looks like. In this case study, there's this hospital, okay? In this hospital, they've got an in-house pharmacy. And what the management was witnessing is that most of the people who went to the pharmacy to get their medicines, there was this huge wait time. So it used to work something like this. So they had their prescriptions in hand. They would go to the pharmacy and they would get a token counter, right? And then they would take their seats. When their time came, they would go up to the counter, they'd present their prescription, and then the pharmacist would pick their medicines. Then they'd be asked to go to the cash counter where they'd pay their bill, and then they'd be given their medicines, and then they'd depart, right? It seems to be like, okay, why isn't this really working, right? So what would the traditional approach usually be like, right? You'd have your observations, right? So you'll have observational studies, qualitative and quantitative research methodologies that you'd employ. You'd actually talk to various people, the employees, some of the patients, that's to say the customers, the management, people from the inventory side of things, the entire supply chain is something that you'd actually try and understand. What happens at the end of this process is that you're trying to squeeze out efficiency from every bit of the process. So let's say that if something takes 12 seconds to do, you want to reduce it to 10 seconds. That's sort of the kind of approach that we've taken. And it's also the client's expectation to be as such. So it could lead to the formation of these very detailed data-heavy Excel sheets. It could lead to the formation of your user journeys, like process maps and a service blueprint for a service design project. Usually that's what happens. And at the end of it all, what do we actually arrive at? We arrive at recommendations for some sort of new technology that could be integrated, some fancy robotics and things as such, some advanced inventory management software, right? And then there could also be training programs that would be given to the staff to tell them that, okay, this is how you can do things better. And that's the usual, that's about 90% of the stuff that service designers are expected to do, right? But like, this is too good to be true, because stuff is actually like this, right? It isn't so clean, cut and dry. It doesn't usually happen. It's really messy. We don't know what is connected to what. And the parts and the relationship, most importantly, between these various changing things, right? They are largely unknown. All that we're trying to do is that we have our blinders on and we said, okay, we're going to focus on this because that is what we see before us, that the client asks us to do. And we're just going to focus on that. And we do that and we deliver. The problem with such an approach is that most of these solutions tend to be short-lived, right? Because they'll work for a certain period of time, and then as things change, and they might also be, by the way, unintended, like side effects. So it's possible for us to do an intervention now, and it could, like disrupt something very heavily later on, because again, the paths and the relationships are unknown. And so when we envision something like this, right? So the reality is it's something like this. Okay, so there are these huge components that we are not really aware of when we are very focused on the service itself. So in the linear approach that we described, we are obsessing over this service and we are like drilling down into every nook and cranny of this service, right? But to really zoom out and appreciate the complexity within which this particular project lies, it's quite a huge challenge. And that is the kind of approach that we took to actually solve this kind of a problem. What we did is that we created a huge systems map, right? So when you start out, it's this a huge artifact that is created and it covers up entire walls, ceilings, floors, you name it. And at the end of it all, we are able to actually identify some of these dynamics, that are at play, which define the problems that we're trying to solve. In order to really appreciate something of this complexity, we have to be able to have to understand the vocabulary, the various fundamental principles that define that problem in that sense. And though that's not a part of this talk, it's something that we did do. And what I'm going to show you is what was the result of that effort. What happened is that, okay, having done this entire systems map, one of the things that we realized was happening was that the doctors were prescribing brand names, right? So what happened is that it's usually something that you remember very quickly and it's easy enough to write on the prescription sheet. We in that hospital, we don't have typed prescription sheets, so usually written down. It was a very quick kind of a prescription thing. But according to the regulations of the Indian Medical Council, right, till as far as possible, generic brand names were supposed to be given. Now, what used to happen, because the brand names were mentioned, is that the pharmacist would receive the prescription, then they check the database if that exact brand was there or not, right? And if it was there, very good. But in several cases, you'd find that that exact branding wasn't available. So they'd have to actually check the chemical composition of that medicine. This took up time. And then again, they'd ask the customer if they were fine with that alternative brand, right? Because it's a thing that people have preferences for certain brands. And if they were fine, then okay, then you'd have the entire billing process. Now imagine if an average customer has about, let's say, 4 medications that they need to do, right? And then in any given hour, let's say there are about 70 to 80 people who are at the counter at that point in time, right? Just imagine the amount of delays that is being caused just simply because of this. And I'm not saying that this was the only problem, but this is one of those problems that would not have been possible to be arrived at without a systems understanding of things, because we looked at the legal side of things, right? And we went as far as to understand the mining processes that actually cause delays in the production of the medicines themselves. At a policy level, at a regulatory level, what were these various things that were happening? And that actually allowed us to come up with this insight. It was it was an amazing time to see that, okay, had we done this in the usual linear way, we wouldn't probably have been able to do this. So this is what it was. So we focused on this stuff here, and then we were able to do that, right? Now, what happens in the service blueprint? Now, I'd just like to take a minute to explain some of the problems that I've seen when I've been using, like me and my team, of course, in various contexts, we've been using the service blueprint, and it's amazing for prototyping services. There's no denying that, right? But when it comes to its use as a tool for analysis, it's really difficult because services inherently are not linear. You've got parallel things, you've got intermediate steps, you've got things that are happening. There's so many small steps that are happening that you don't even mention on the blueprint. I was working for an international banking company, and we had a 20-foot wide, like blueprint. But the problem is that once you have a blueprint that looks something like this, right, it becomes virtually useless. It becomes useless. Like, I won't use virtually, it becomes useless because you don't really know now what to do with it. You've interviewed a lot of people to arrive at this information, but you don't really know what to do with it. It's not something that can then be analyzed and arrived at. You can't arrive at, like insights, very good insights from such a complex piece of diagram. So and because of the linear flow, it's sort of restricted because services inherently are sort of network. It's very difficult to depict networks in such a linear process flow. And the other problem with the blueprint is that it is heavily grounded in shallow ecology, meaning it is human-centric. You're talking primarily about the customer's experience. And then if everything is around the customer, right, then the ecology goes for a toss. You don't care about anything else much. And I know that, yes, the client is paying you because they want the customers to be happy, but it's very important for us to have a wider perspective and then focus on something rather than just focusing on one thing and then not caring about everything else. So it's the other way around. And the other problem is that you've got this watch in an ice cube. My drawing's like pretty bad in this one, but I hope you get it. The problem is that most of these blueprints that we develop, because we put in such a huge amount of effort in these, it's very difficult for us to keep changing it. It's very difficult to do that, but time doesn't change and the context keeps changing. This is possible to do in a systems map. So this is a blurred image of a systems map because it's a client artifact. It's intentionally blurred. So what we actually did in this is that this part right here, it was developed when COVID struck. So we were doing this project pre-COVID, and as soon as COVID struck, we were able to introduce this entire new segment to it and update the systems map. And that gave us immediate insights into how the rest of the products are going to be impacted. And this actually led to way better prototype services. And the services were then, of course, far more adapted. So like we could adapt those services very quickly. And this is something that is very difficult to do in a service blueprint. You cannot really do that. But again, recognize the problem that how do you actually convert, like how do you merge both of these? And I think the Kristel's system design toolkit that I read in the article, it's an amazing way to do that, right? But we've been exploring things on our own. So here's like a 10-second clip just to show you what we've been working on. It's very conceptual, but again, these are the various elements that we've got. They're sort of interconnected. And then we have these various dynamics that are identified. And then what we do is we sort of segregate them into layers. Now, this seems like magic that's happening here, right? But that's for another paper, hopefully, which if Touchpoint does allow me, I'd like to publish it with you guys. That's fine. But we're working on that. And it's really difficult to do that in a toolkit format as well. And I heartily agree with Kristel when she said that it's really difficult to engage stakeholders in something as complex as a systems map. It's really difficult to do that. And I really applaud the effort for making something that's very nicely used in a workshop format. That's awesome. We're trying some things as well, and let's see where that goes. And yeah, so this is the last part of it. So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Suneet. And yes, please, of course, we're always interested in what you're working on as an next article. Next, I'd like to introduce J-Paul Neeley, who was another contributor to this issue. J-Paul, if you'd like to begin, you're welcome.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yeah, really excited to be with you today and share a few thoughts on this topic. It's one I think that's incredibly important for our practices today. So I'll just begin sharing thoughts on the idea of considering everything and aligning service design practice with our complex reality. And I know many of you will have had this similar experience, but in a lot of our practice over the years, we sort of bump into problems where we are asked to go to solve for larger and larger systems. And many of the solutions that we run into actually don't exist within the system that we're designing for. So for example, we've done some work with the UK's policy lab, the Cabinet Office, looking at shifting from prevention of or treatment of homelessness to prevention of homelessness. And in the past now we're playing with policy levers, where in the past we were playing with maybe different types of services that we could deliver to those individuals. But I think across the types of work that we're doing, we're asked to make this sort of leap into larger and larger service systems, larger and larger systems beyond services, and to make adjustments there. And I just mentioned in the start of my contribution, and I'm sure all of you have felt this, the same value transition that we saw as service design began to emerge, and the shift from just focusing on product or narrow focuses on particular parts of a business offering. As we've moved into larger service design and service systems, there's a huge amount of value that's created. And I believe the same sort of leap is in front of us as we begin to integrate in a lot of these ideas that are being shared into our own practices. So one of the particular ideas that I wanted to share and that I'm quite keen on or quite concerned about even with this shift is that many times when we're designing, we identify a particular problem, we draw a circle around it, and then we solve for that particular service or that particular offering. And then we put this back into the world. But in reality, we have no idea what we've done at that point, because really we've introduced something new into the world, and we've basically ignored every other interaction or possible connection to focus on that particular service. So the lines that we draw around things, the boundaries that we actually create are all false. Everything is connected to everything else, and nothing exists in isolation, even if that's multiple degrees of separation away. And one of the problems with this, where we're sort of blindly designing and introducing new things into the world, is that we introduce externalities, right? I love Paul Virilio. The invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. And in our work, we're constantly inventing new shipwrecks, many unintended, and many that we're completely unaware of, and many that exist several degrees of separation from the space that we're working in. But it's a significant problem. And I think many of the major issues we face today are actually the cumulative effects of our optimizing for parts without considering how everything fits together. So this has sort of been such a nagging problem in our practice that we've kind of suggesting that we need a whole new kind of design. There are new mindsets, new toolkits, new approaches that are needed to begin operating in this complex reality where nothing exists in isolation and everything is interconnected. And so I'll just mention a few of the principles that we've sort of identified. And again, I think there's a huge wealth of systemic design work that is being done. These are maybe ideas that can exist on top of that work or in relation to that work that kind of support some of those approaches. But I would suggest they actually even challenge a little bit further what's going on, that there are even some limits to the way we're thinking about current system design that need to be overcome. So I'll share 3 of these principles just as an example. One is anytime we consider anything less than everything, we are missing something. So always, there are pieces in the world, bits of information that we are not taking into account, as it's impossible to consider everything. Just the acknowledgement that we're missing something actually does great things for our practice. Another idea is that nothing can be isolated from anything because it's always connected to everything. That literally, no matter how many degrees of separation we look at, there are connections that exist between the most disparate pieces of our world. There's somehow comfort that comes from suggesting that this is a domain that we're working in and this is somehow isolated from everything else. But in reality, those domains don't exist, and there is bleed, there's flow, and there's movement between them. The other thing that's interesting is the idea that good is good and bad is bad and good, and often we can't tell the difference. So the only way you can create a value judgment on a particular part of the system is by limiting that and focusing on that. But if you realize that boundary is false, then you realize that actually this could be good, it could be bad, and that judgment is completely dependent on our perspective. So with those principles in mind, I'm really interested in new types of practices that emerge. And one is the idea of considering everything. And I'll give a few examples of these 3 practices really quickly. So on consider everything, it's literally that. We want in our design of everything, we think we have to consider everything. And while that is impossible, the very attempt actually radically changes the way in which we go about the design. A few years ago, this project, The Anatomy of an AI System, I'm sure many of you have seen it. It won the UK's Design Museum Design of the Year Award. And I think it's a spectacular project. They look at the Amazon Echo, and from every single part, from the human operator, the infrastructure, the machine learning models, the skills, the data exploitation, the geological processes and disposing, all of this is considered. What's, I think, tragic about this is actually that this won an award. I think actually this should be the norm. And if we're ever designing a project where we don't have this level of background on the space that we're operating within, we're actually operating blind. And so this type of completely holistic view of the spaces we're working in is what I think is necessary going forward. Another idea is that if we're designing then in that type of context, we actually have to take universal responsibility for our actions. We're not just responsible for the needs of the client or the needs of the service we're designing. We're actually responsible for all of the knock-on effects within everything, and no matter how many degrees of separation. So for example, we did a little project a few years ago we called Night Night Everyone. And it's a little line of code that you can drop into your website. And at a certain point each night, it puts the website to sleep. And it's to highlight this moment, this transition, where the value of the website and the exploitation of the user to generate revenue, that value is less for the user than could be had by them going to sleep or them taking care of their well-being. And as a designer, if I'm considering everything, I actually have to be responsible for their well-being as well as everything else going on. And this would include carbon footprint, etc. If needed, you can click through and of course use the site. And the last principle I wanted to share is the idea of grand priorities. If you're considering everything, then all of the issues that are taking hold begin to have a sort of priority list. Why are we even working on some problems when other things exist in the wider world? And one of the examples of this is, I think, climate change. We now include this slide in every interaction with clients in all of our presentations, in the websites that we create, and ask the question, whatever you're doing right now, or the statement really, whatever you're doing right now is probably not as important as addressing global warming. And so the idea that if you're considering everything, there's a natural sort of grand priority and hierarchy of issues that we should be working on. And all of your projects has to fit within that and have to speak to that reality, or else we're ignoring something that's incredibly serious. So those are three sort of provocations to consider everything, take universal responsibility for the impact of your work, regardless of the number of degrees of separation. And all of your work must connect within the sort of grand priorities that are at play across our world. And I think that type of practice and those types of shift will enable, really new and interesting, meaningful types of value to be created from service design practice. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, J. Paul. Now we're going to hear again from Josina, who again put a really nice written context around the different articles in the theme. And she'll have the chance to ask some questions of her own, of both Tuomas and the rest of the speakers that you've just heard. So Josina, you can take it away again.
Thanks all three of you for sharing really interesting provocations and movements in this space. I'm a fan of tensions, so I kind of want to push on one that I see between all of the things that you shared. There seems to me to be this tension between really working with these higher order complexity. So Suneet, you said when higher order complexity, when we work at these systems maps and it becomes so big, it becomes useless. And then J. Paul, you're saying like, we need to consider everything. Projects should be completely holistic in view. And Kristel, you said, the project isn't really linear, but we needed to kind of like map it out in a linear way in order to support understandability. So it seems a bit like systems thinking and integrating it into our practice is a bit of a walking contradiction or a hypocrisy. And I want to open that up to all of you and just see, how do we contend with this tension between really grappling with the, everything being connected to something else and the understandability and ability to kind of sense and feel and navigate and not be paralyzed. Maybe J. Paul, can I start with you if you have an immediate reaction to that? I found your piece quite provoking around that. And then if anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And that tension is very real. My thought is that we build for understandability, but understandability is actually false to the reality of the system. So there's this comfort that we build by saying, look, I understand the system, and look at how pretty this abstraction is, and look how simple it is. We've made sense of it. But that sense that we've made is actually false to the reality. Now, I also acknowledge that mapping everything and understanding everything is not possible. But I think there's a new type of humility and sort of a new type of gut check that exists with all of our representations of the complexity when we realize that they're always false, and that all of our attempts at understandability will not take us far enough, will leave us with significant gaps. So you're right, it's a contradiction, but it always exists, and I think it needs to be built in. We have to eliminate the comfort we have with our mapping of these systems and highlight how problematic it is.
Thanks. I think that bringing forward humility and discomfort and awareness of what's missing is definitely really key. Does anybody else want to jump in on balancing that tension?
Yeah, I'd like to give it to you.
Please.
Yeah, so first of all, I heavily agree with the humility point. I completely, the reason why I feel very deeply about humility is because up until this moment, when we say that, okay, we are designers, right? And we are bought into an organization that relies very heavily on people with high levels of technical expertise, be it in the realms of technology, where you're doing advanced algorithms, people in the field of management, and then all of a sudden designers come, we say that, okay, I'm going to help you with services without like that level of expertise to the guys whom we like are telling that, okay, we are going to do this stuff for you. I know we are going to be doing it in a collaborative manner, but we primarily rely on their expertise to get stuff done. Is that, and we used to do this in this nice workshop format where we call everyone together. We have these posters. We used to frame a very nice, pretty picture of what is possible. But I think when it comes to systems, this aspect that, okay, we require ourselves, like as designers, we ourselves are required to be very technically proficient in the field of systems if we really want to do systems. This sense of just rely on the expertise of others and sort of be the person who enables things to happen. But if I really want to contribute actively towards that, apart from just enabling things to happen, then a deep expertise of systems is something that I feel will set systems designers, so as to say, stand apart from traditionally perceived service designers. That's the thing. And that is something that, fortunately, I've been lucky enough to see that this, at least a small segment of the corporate world is recognizing this fact. Right, that we are not going to be hiring someone who's going to help us just do personas, journeys, blueprints. No, we want people who can give us that something extra, who are very good at themselves. And this is a field that is so difficult to like just acquire organically, something that and to do. It's really difficult. There's a reason, because it requires training, it requires study. And we have to put in the work if we really want to be good at it. And the results reflect that, right? The kind of services that we design with an understanding of systems have a different level of impact.
Thanks, Suneet. I'm wondering, Tuomas or Kristel, if you want to comment on that, because you're both bringing in this kind of, Tuomas, the systems intelligence to help complement. And Kristel, in your talk, you talked about seeking out this expertise and feeling like you needed to make sense of it. Do either of you want to build on that? And what, do we need more technical skills also in systems thinking in order to do this work?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I definitely we could get help from big data to inform more evidence-based for the system maps especially. But for the initial question, like the tension between complexity and simplicity, we want to look at it pragmatically. For a lot of clients and stakeholders, because we always do co-creation, systems thinking and looking at the whole is very overwhelming. So especially in the beginning of the project, we keep it simple for them. It might become more complex afterwards, but we like to present it in a more simple, rather linear way that they're used to. And it's we, the designers, who have to understand the complexity and who have to work with this complexity. And of course, some of the clients are really mature, and then you go up and go further. Another thing that really helps is to let your clients and stakeholders understand that what you're really looking for is to make your products and services leverages in the system. So they're not just there for the customer experience, but they're also there really to create change in other domains of the system. So that's how we deal with it.
Great point. I think that actually taps into what Jay Paul was getting at around the grand priorities as well, to see your work within these larger aims in the system. So thank you. Tuomas, did you want to add on to that from your perspective?
Well, a lot of what I was planning to say has already been said. Also, especially the tension. I work a lot with simulation studies, and they've been debating these issues on how accurate something should be for the last 50 years without coming up with any real actual solution to this topic. So we have plenty of time to think about this in the future as well. But sort of, I would go very much on a case-by-case basis. When I work with this stuff with clients, I let them work on the system. For example, this ties to one of the audience questions already. So working with a blueprint and then actually asking people what affects this and so forth. And suddenly we are expanding from the original concept. And then the next question is, how do we implement the next stages? And again, what do we need here? So bringing it to reality and reaching a kind of stage or a saturation point where people see enough, but it doesn't become completely useless.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a fine balance we have to walk in service design, I think. The other question I wanted to open up to all of you, maybe Suneet, you showed this kind of the example of kind of zooming in on a service with a linear flow of trying to get a prescription at a pharmacy. And then when you zoomed out, you showed actually there are all of these other things going on that we need to account for. And I wondered from all of you, do you think that integrating systems thinking and this zooming out view and the considering everything is disruptive to or dismantles the project, the notion of a project that we tend to use in service design? This idea that we have a set period of time that we're, typically working with a client, and we follow, a set linear kind of infrastructure and have a deliverable at the end. Is this possible when we're trying to consider complexity, when we're trying to work towards grand priorities or, go beyond the service blueprint? Does this actually shift kind of the foundations of how we work in organizations and how we deliver service design services in general? Any thoughts on that?
I can answer this.
Please.
I'll have a first go on it. That when you design within a systemic, holistic view, you don't end up with a final project. It's not like this is it, because the system is always in evolution. There is a context that's continuously changing. But of course, in the ideal world, you would go on forever as a designer, but there is no budget for that. So what we try then to do is to empower as quickly as possible the stakeholders and the client in the system, so that they are able to continue the work without us. But that's very important, that they really can adapt. You want to have a solution at the end, or we call it an intervention model, that is really adaptable by the stakeholders in the system.
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting point to think about, that ongoing adaptation rather than the kind of solution deliverable. Tuomas, please jump in.
I think this kind of continuation is one of the key things which is so easy to forget in this business when we are giving the client basically what they want and forgetting the rule of thinking what is actually needed. And in a similar way, I think it's easy to forget that we actually have the very core of addressing systemic things in the toolkit of any good service designer. We are supposed to involve a sufficient number of stakeholders, and those stakeholders are supposed to bring in enough understanding of the complexity of the issue. And we're selling the whole process short if we go for just linear results, especially if those are not ongoing. So we have the route, we're just not always remembering to use it properly.
Thank you. Suneet or J-Paul, do you want to jump in that briefly before we turn it over to Jesse to take some audience questions, or do you want to pass on that? Okay.
What we've done actually is that we know that systems is difficult for people to do by themselves, right? When you talk about the deliverables of a project, we don't even promise a systems map as a deliverable. We use that as the engine in the background, and the deliverables that we promise to the client are an entirely different set of things altogether. But what we do is that we show them the systems map and we walk them through it, and we show them the value that is it's being derived because of that systems engine. And then when it's a sort of a loose handover. It's not, we don't really expect them to do something with it because it's incredibly complex, right? They require a degree of facilitation, but purely from a very pragmatic standpoint, that sort of extends a relationship with the client, because they then trust us a little bit more, seeing that, okay, they've entrusted us with a certain part of the project. Let's say the larger objective for the firm, we want to do such kind of things within 12 months or something like that. And the project that we received was, let's say, for 6 months, right? Then seeing the systems map, it only makes sense for them to continue and let us, prolong the project for bigger impacts for the remaining 6 months as well. So it's a strong business case as well for designers to make when we say that, okay, here's the systems map. We are going to keep adapting it and enable you to derive more value from it. And it's going to help the designers and their clients have a very strong relationship as well. So that's really worked out for us.
Yeah, so it sounds like that involvement and participation are being super critical, and then that ongoing work in progress and adaptation that Kristel mentioned. J-Paul, do you want to add a quick thing, and then I'll turn it over for audience questions?
No, just that, yeah, I agree. And so much of this is who the client is and the budgets and deliverables required and the current needs of the business, all of those things very often don't align with the sort of well-being of the system. And the outcome desired by those groups also doesn't often equal the well-being of the larger system. So again, it's a really important tension that you point out. But I agree that sort of involvement with more parties and this handoff idea or continuation idea are good steps.
Great. And I think actually in the Touchpoint piece, there are a couple of case studies that get in a little bit like, how do we work across organizational boundaries, not just within this particular domain, move beyond some of this project notion. So thank you all. Jesse, I'll let you take it away from here for audience questions.
Okay, thanks, Josina. So I've got 2 questions I'd like to ask from the audience, and we'll just pick one, whoever on the panel would like to jump in. The first comes from Liron, and she's essentially saying, how do you help a client navigate the deep complexity that gets presented to them once a whole system is modeled? How do you support someone in even making decisions and not just drowning in the detail that would be uncovered in work like that?
Well, again, we have a very pragmatic way of dealing with this, depending on the client, but we make a mini system map with only the leverage points. That is much more understandable for them. Okay. So it focuses on what they can actually affect, where they can affect change and where it's best done. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I often think of the distinction between understanding the tool we're using and then communicating. And it is true that sometimes we modify those representations or abstractions for communication.
Okay, I've got then, and Lisa, just congratulations, Justin, under the gun. How do you monitor if you're making progress or a positive impact while you're designing systems? Lisa says, I would imagine that measuring and seeing success from systems interventions is complex and might take some time. So how do you do it while that process is underway?
May I take this, Jess?
Please, Suneet, sure.
Yeah, so it's as you already know, it's really complex. So what we actually do is that as part of the project planning phase, we make it a point to have an MLE framework that's designed right from the get-go. And this is something that isn't usually accepted by the private sector, so as to say the startups and the corporates, but especially in the social development space, when we are developing an MLE framework, in that case, we make it a point that it's very nicely integrated with the systems map that we are creating. So it is very much a part of the project timeline, and it's not something that during the course of it, we don't really see it as, that, okay, now we need to design an entire new thing that has to then be integrated with systems. No, it actually happens in parallel. So being a part of the project itself, it isn't as complex as you think it would be. And see, especially in the case of social development projects, you have goals that are quite, they are gargantuan goals, right? You want to decrease, let's say, you want to impact a certain SDG or something like that. And it takes a lot of time. You cannot measure it within that. But what we talk about is moving the needle. So we know that, okay, we have these litmus tests, so as to say. So for example, the project might be very focused on running a pilot program, which may which may show very promising results, and that itself shows potential that we're able to gain a certain amount of interest, let's say from a target demography, and that for us is good enough. And that is what is actually we are measuring through the MLE framework. And the systems map, as you know, that it keeps on evolving, right? So it's not static. We don't say that, okay, for the remaining 5 years, when we actually need to do something, we're going to be keeping it static. And we ensure that if the project is getting extended beyond a certain period of time, the MLE framework and the systems map both change hand in hand. And that's how the constant shifting of the needle is measured, and with an eye on the goal, of course. That's what we do.
Okay, thank you. I'm just a little concerned about the time, so we're just going to wrap up. I'd like to begin first by thanking everyone who participated on the panel today, the guest editors, and also the authors that we had. Of course, we can still continue this discussion on Slack. So there is the Touchpoint channel in the SDN Slack group. Please post any other questions there you'd like. We do have that running all the time, no matter what the issue is. I'd like to make another few quick announcements. The first is we do have a call for papers open for the next issue of Touchpoint, and that is on the topic of service design with the planet in mind. So the sustainability aspects as they touch on service design and what service designers should think about. There's a link you can find in our social media and on the SDN website, of course, for that call for papers, which is open for the coming week or so, 2 weeks. This is Service Design Day, so you can follow the hashtag SDDay21 on our social media. And there's a lot of other activities happening from our chapters around the world. And lastly, the SDN has recently launched practitioner accreditation. And as well, we have a special offer on discounts on our professional and master accreditations. Those are available on the SDN's website. So thank you for taking part, everyone. It's been really nice to have you here, and we'll share a link. I'd invite you to read this issue if you haven't already, either by buying it and reading it online or having it sent to you in print. So it's been great to have you here, and I wish you a nice rest of the day wherever you are.